It is the morning of August 2nd, 1914. On the quayside at Barrow-in-Furness, 500 Ottoman sailors stand in formation, resplendent in their dress whites beneath an overcast northern sky. They have sailed from Constantinople for this moment. Their commander, Captain Ralph Bey, holds the commissioning papers in his hand. Somewhere behind those dockyard walls sits the Reşadiye, 559 feet of British-built steel, displacing over 22,000 long tons, fitted with 10 13.5-inch guns and the most advanced fire control systems money could buy. She is, in every measurable respect, one of the most powerful warships on Earth, and she belongs to the Ottoman Empire. The Turks have paid for her in full. The ceremony is scheduled to begin within the hour. Then a British naval officer walks across the yard, approaches Captain Ralph, and informs him, quietly and without ceremony, that the ship will not be handed over. Not today, not ever. Requisitioned, the officer says, by order of the First Lord of the Admiralty. The captain stares at him. Half a world away, the machinery of a continental war is grinding into motion. But in this quiet Lancashire shipyard, the most consequential theft in modern naval history has just been committed with nothing more than a politely delivered letter and a great deal of British nerve. What happened in that yard and in the weeks that followed would not merely reshape the balance of naval power in the Mediterranean. It would drag a neutral empire into the bloodiest conflict in human history, open the Middle Eastern theatre of the First World War, and contribute directly to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of men. And it all began with Churchill deciding to help himself to someone else's battleships. To understand why this theft was even possible, you have to understand the peculiar predicament in which the Royal Navy found itself in the summer of 1914. Britain's naval supremacy, the cornerstone of her global empire, rested on a single principle: numerical dominance over Germany. The Anglo-German naval arms race had been running for over a decade, an increasingly expensive game of escalation in which both powers commissioned ever larger, ever more lethal dreadnought battleships. By July 1914, Britain held a margin of advantage over the German high seas fleet of just 7 of these vessels, 7 ships. That was the difference between dominance and vulnerability. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty since 1911, understood this with a clarity that sometimes outpaced his scruples. He had presided over a naval expansion program of formidable ambition, laying down ships faster than any peacetime budget could comfortably justify. But dreadnoughts take years to build. They cannot be improvised. And as the July crisis deepened following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Churchill looked at his figures and felt the margin shrink. Then he looked at the dockyard. There, in Barrow-in-Furness, and on the Tyne at Armstrong's Elswick Yard, sat 2 magnificent ships, the Reşadiye and the Sultan Osman I, built to British designs, fitted with British guns, crewed by men who had not yet taken possession. The Reşadiye carried 10 13.5-inch guns, broadly equivalent to the best British dreadnoughts then in service. The Sultan Osman was, if anything, more extraordinary: 14 12-inch guns, making her the most heavily armed battleship of her size anywhere in the world. Together, these 2 ships would transform any fleet fortunate enough to possess them. The problem was that they did not belong to Britain. They had been ordered, designed, and paid for by the Ottoman Empire, and paid for, moreover, in a fashion that made their seizure morally thornier still. The story of the Reşadiye and the Sultan Osman did not begin in a boardroom or a treasury. It began with ordinary people. Throughout the Ottoman Empire, from Constantinople to remote Anatolian villages, ordinary citizens had contributed to a public subscription to fund these ships. School children handed over pocket money, women sold jewelry, taverns and coffee houses organized collections, mosques took up donations. The ships were not merely weapons, they were national symbols, tangible proof that the Ottoman Empire, diminished by decades of territorial loss and humiliation, could still field a modern navy. They were going to reclaim Ottoman dignity in the Aegean against Greece. They were going to project Ottoman power in the Black Sea against Russia. The political significance could not have been lost on Churchill. Admiral Arthur Limpus, head of the British naval mission to Constantinople, had spent years cultivating a warm relationship with the Ottoman Navy Ministry. Britain was the empire's chosen partner. The nation Cemal Pasha, the naval minister, had trusted with the construction of the modern Ottoman fleet. A lavish Navy Week had been arranged in Constantinople to celebrate the arrival of the Reşadiye, complete with ceremonies honouring British-Ottoman friendship. Limpus himself had sailed out to greet the ships. By 21st July, with the July crisis deepening, the British government had already quietly postponed delivery. On 29th July, Churchill ordered the Royal Navy to prevent any Ottoman personnel from boarding either vessel. 2 days later, on July 31st, soldiers from the Sherwood Foresters Regiment physically boarded the Reşadiye and raised the white ensign above her. On August 3rd, the Sultan Osman followed. The Reşadiye became HMS Erin. The Sultan Osman became HMS Agincourt. No compensation was offered, the money was simply kept. In purely strategic terms, it was a masterstroke. Churchill had acquired 2 capital ships overnight without a single shell fired. The Reşadiye was a vessel of 22,780 long tons at normal load, powered by Parsons turbines generating 26,500 shaft horsepower, capable of 21 knots, and fitted with a secondary armament of 6-inch guns that outclassed comparable British vessels' 4-inch pieces. HMS Agincourt, formerly the Sultan Osman, was arguably the most curious warship in the Royal Navy's history. She carried 14 12-inch guns in 7 twin turrets, arranged along her centerline in a configuration so unusual that naval architects still argue about her optimal fighting profile. Her broadside weight of shell was extraordinary. Both ships served throughout the war. Both fought at Jutland. In Whitehall, the Tatler magazine ran a photograph of Churchill under the headline, "Bravo Winston, the rapid mobilization and purchase of the 2 foreign dreadnoughts spoke volumes for your work and wisdom." The British press celebrated. In Constantinople, the reaction was rather different. Here is where the party trick becomes something considerably darker than a parlour game. The Ottoman Empire had not yet decided which side to join, or whether to join any side at all. A faction within the Ottoman government, led by the pro-German war minister Enver Pasha, was pressing for alliance with Berlin. Another faction counselled neutrality or even cooperation with the Entente. In August 1914, neither side had yet prevailed. The empire teetered on a knife's edge, and the seizure of the Reşadiye and Sultan Osman gave Enver exactly the propaganda he needed. The Germans had already anticipated this. Ambassador Hans von Wangenheim in Constantinople had been arguing for weeks that Britain could not be trusted, that Ottoman money spent in British yards was money wasted, that the empire's future lay eastward with Germany. Now here was the proof. 500 Ottoman sailors had stood on a Lancashire quayside with their commissioning papers, and the British had taken the ships anyway. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Germany moved immediately. The two German warships then operating in the Mediterranean, the battle cruiser SMS Goeben and the light cruiser SMS Breslau, were ordered to make for Constantinople. These were not trivial vessels. The Goeben was a Moltke-class battle cruiser of 22,979 tons, armed with 10 11-inch guns and capable of approximately 28 knots. Fast enough to outrun virtually anything the Royal Navy could put in her path. The Breslau was a lighter vessel, 5,700 tons with a top speed of 27.5 knots. Rear Admiral Wilhelm Souchon commanded both. The pursuit that followed has since been called one of the most consequential naval chases in history. Souchon conducted it with extraordinary verve, first bombarding French ports in Algeria to complicate Britain's strategic position, then coaling at Messina before racing eastward through the Mediterranean. The British fleet, hampered by ambiguous orders, a paralyzing obsession with not engaging superior forces, and a set of standing instructions that Churchill himself later struggled to interpret clearly, failed to intercept them. British battle cruisers, Indomitable and Indefatigable, shadowed the Goeben briefly on August 4th. But at that precise moment, Britain and Germany were still technically at peace, the ultimatum not expiring until midnight. The admirals watched. They let her go. Rear Admiral Troubridge, commanding a cruiser squadron to the east of Messina, was ordered to intercept but turned away, calculating, wrongly many argued, that the Goeben's superior firepower made the action suicidal. He was later court-martialed, though acquitted. On August 10, 1914, the Goeben and Breslau arrived at the Dardanelles. The Ottoman Empire was still officially neutral. What happened next was pure diplomatic theatre, and it worked perfectly. Germany presented the two ships as a sail. The Goeben became the Yavuz Sultan Selim. The Breslau became the Midilli. Named after an Ottoman sultan and a Greek island respectively, they were nominally transferred to the Ottoman Navy. Their German crews remained aboard. Their German commanders remained in charge. Admiral Souchon was appointed commander-in-chief of the entire Ottoman fleet. The sailors donned fezzes. On paper, two German warships had simply ceased to exist, and two Ottoman vessels had materialized in their place. It was, to employ the mildest possible term, a fiction understood by everyone. The strategic consequences came quickly. On October 29, 1914, Souchon took the Goeben, Breslau, and a squadron of Turkish vessels into the Black Sea and bombarded the Russian ports of Sevastopol, Odessa, Novorossiysk, and Feodosia. Russian and Ottoman ships exchanged fire. 14 German sailors aboard the Goeben died when Russian shells struck her aft smokestack. The Goeben herself sank the Russian minelayer Prut, which was carrying 700 mines. The attack was, technically, conducted under the Ottoman flag, by the nominal Ottoman fleet. It was also, unmistakably, an act of war. Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire on November 2nd. Britain and France followed on November 4th. The Ottoman Empire had entered the First World War. The Gallipoli campaign, the Mesopotamian campaign, the campaigns in Palestine and the Caucasus, all of them, in ways direct and indirect, flow from this sequence of events. The Dardanelles, which Churchill himself would attempt to force with catastrophic results, would not have been barred to Allied shipping without the Ottoman entry into the war. That entry owed much to the presence of the Goeben in Constantinople, and the Goeben's presence in Constantinople owed much to Germany's ability to exploit the rage and humiliation generated by Britain's theft of the Reşadiye and the Sultan Osman. To compare the two acts of confiscation side by side is to observe an interesting asymmetry. Britain's seizure was, in purely material terms, superior. HMS Erin and HMS Agincourt were both genuinely excellent ships. HMS Erin served at the Battle of Jutland on 31st May 1916, firing her main armament in anger in the greatest naval engagement in history. HMS Agincourt, with her 14 guns, was described by crews as resembling a floating fortress, deafening and spectacular in action. Neither ship was lost during the war. The German gift, by contrast, was a piece of diplomatic theatre that never pretended to be genuine. The Goeben was a superb vessel. Her superior speed was, as one contemporary American naval analyst writing in 1917 noted, not fully appreciated by the Allies until too late. But Germany did not give Turkey the Goeben. Germany lent Turkey the fiction of the Goeben, retaining the crew, the commander, and, ultimately, the ship itself, which was promised to remain German property until the war concluded. What Germany gained was not the loss of a warship, but the acquisition of an empire, and the British gave it to them. The Goeben's subsequent career is a story of sustained improbability. Operating in the Black Sea throughout 1914 and 1915, she used her speed advantage to avoid engagements with Russian dreadnoughts that might have destroyed her, harassing Russian shipping and convoying Ottoman coal freighters. By late 1915, the commissioning of the Russian Imperatrica Maria-class battleships, which outgunned the Goeben at close range, reduced her freedom of action, but she adapted. After the Russian Revolution removed the Black Sea threat entirely, she returned to the Dardanelles region for operations in the eastern Mediterranean. On January 20, 1918, now under Vice Admiral Hubert von Reber-Paschwitz, the Goeben and Breslau sortied from the Dardanelles to attack British monitors near the island of Imbros, sinking too. It was a brief, violent success. The return journey was catastrophic. The Breslau struck multiple mines and sank. The Goeben herself hit 3 mines, was attacked repeatedly from the air, and ran aground on a sandbank. She survived, just. She was eventually refloated and limped back through the Dardanelles. Today, she still exists. Renamed Yavuz after the Turkish Republic was founded, she served as a symbol of the new Turkish Navy until 1950 and was stricken in 1954. Efforts were made in the 1960s to preserve her as a museum ship, but funding fell through. She was eventually scrapped in the 1970s in Gölcük, Turkey. HMS Erin and HMS Agincourt were both broken up in the early 1920s under the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty. Returned then to the quayside at Barrow-in-Furness, to Captain Ralph Bay, standing in his dress uniform with his commissioning papers and his 500 men, being told by a British officer that the ship behind those gates is not his and never will be. The British seized 2 ships and called it strategic necessity. They offered no compensation and made no apology. The Tatler applauded. The Admiralty was satisfied. The dreadnought margin improved. In the short run, everything worked exactly as Churchill intended. In the long run, that act of naval larceny, committed legally through a loophole and morally through the confidence of imperial power, handed Germany the diplomatic ammunition to pull the Ottoman Empire into a war that would, among other things, kill 44,000 Commonwealth soldiers at Gallipoli alone. It opened the Dardanelles question that nearly ended Churchill's own career. It shut Allied shipping out of the Black Sea and strangled Russia's access to Western supply, contributing to the pressures that collapsed the Tsar's government in 1917. It reshaped the entire Middle East. the map of which we largely still live with today. All from a letter, all from a politely delivered no, all from the peculiarly British habit of requisitioning other people's property and calling it administration. The Reşadiye had been built to make Ottoman sailors proud. Instead, she sailed into the Battle of Jutland as HMS Erin, firing her guns in someone else's war. The ships were stolen with a piece of paper. The consequences lasted a century.